Okay, so this is going to be the week 3 GoToMeeting recording, and we really just want to focus on kind of a few things you guys are going to be working on this week. So, kind of like the previous week's projects, there's going to be a few different parts. We're kind of done with texturing. Now, it's not to say that you guys are done with texturing, because probably what some of you are going to kind of realize is now that you're kind of seeing your texture inside of Maya and RenderMan, you may find that there's some things that you thought you had lined up right that maybe aren't lining up in the right spot. Or maybe there was a chunk of the pulley and you didn't realize you'd missed texturing in an area, or possibly on the scraper handle, maybe the highlight in the original reference photo is still there. Obviously, we don't want that, so we should remove the highlight. So it is pretty common for some students to sort of go back into Photoshop and kind of clean a few things up. But that's kind of completely up to you guys. If something does look really visually off, and you feel like it's going to hurt the render, try to make some time to go back into Photoshop and clean a few things up. But really the main goal this week is we have kind of an introduction to the materials, which I don't think you guys have really ever used RenderMan materials yet. And probably most of you were using the metal ray materials back when you were in shading and lighting. So you guys all remember the Mental Ray MIA Material X? Yeah, that guy is essentially the equivalent of what we're going to be doing in RenderMan. It's really, really similar. So you'll probably notice there's a lot of like attributes that you just sort of kind of remember. Like you'll see index of refraction. Like that's something you've changed before. You may not remember exactly what it was doing, but you've used that setting before. You've connected stuff into diffuse color. You've probably heard of Fresnel reflections before. You generally know what bump means. So there's still like a lot of common terms and similarities. So I think a lot of you guys will kind of pick up the shader fairly quickly. But the first part this week is going to be basically just connecting your color texture for the pulley and the scraper. Getting that on the material, getting bump working. It's a little hard to see in this image right here, but if you kind of load that image into your image tool and start to zoom in on it, you'll notice that the pulley has bump, like the paint lifts up off the rust behind it. There's really subtle bump details and like the rust over here on the blade. But you're trying to build those three materials: pulley, scraper, and shelf. And the shelf texture is provided for you in the project. It's already UV'd. Really you just have to load in the texture file from the source images, and then you build it just like you would with these guys right here. So the books, you do not have to build yourself. This is kind of like a pretty common mistake people make. If you read the documentation, you'll notice when you get to the part where it talks about the books that I've actually built the full material for you. And there's going to be two kind of nice bonuses about that. One is it just kind of alleviates a little bit of work for you guys, so you're not constructing every single material this week. And the other kind of nice part about having the book materials given to you is if you guys ever feel like you're getting stuck and there's like a connection you're not sure about, you can't remember what node you were supposed to use, if you look at the book materials for reference, like if you graph out the material network, you can actually kind of compare yours to that. You might be able to troubleshoot and kind of figure out what you're missing, or maybe a setting you didn't turn on the right way. And so this is part one, just your basic color and bump. Part two is going to be introducing specularity and reflections. So like making like the metal look like metal, getting the pulley to be reflective. But it's not just really turning on reflections and just saying it's there. It's more about the refinement. So like with the pulley, if we are going to make it reflective, how do we get it so the blue paint is reflective, but maybe the rust isn't? So we're really starting to think about, like on a texture level, how do we make that material work the way we want? Because really, like the rust and the paint are supposed to be two materials. So we have to kind of tell that Pixar material how to do that. Now over here with the scraper, kind of the same idea. We're adding reflections. The handle has a little bit of breakup on it. I'm using specularity maps, roughness maps, which we'll talk about. But basically I'm just trying to get the handle to kind of have a nice sort of semi-shiny kind of reflection on it. Hopefully the dirt on the top is not as reflective, so you can kind of see some little dry patches where it's kind of being broken up. There's a little bit of bump still. And then down here in the blade, it's a little more subtle, but I have a little bit of reflectivity in that kind of exposed metal area. And then down here on the rust, it's much less reflective and kind of dry looking, because obviously it's not, polished. And then part 3, which I'm hoping we have a little time to get to, is going to be doing the back wall. So the one thing that's a little bit different about part 3 is for the first 2 parts this week, you're really just trying to match the reference as close as you can, like just sort of getting the essence of the materials and kind of doing the best you can to make the paint kind of look like about the right reflection intensity, the right brightness, getting the handle to reflect pretty similar to the reference. The thing that's a little bit different about part 3 is when you get to the wall, while I am expecting you guys to get the background wall matching, because I'm giving you that texture, so like you have that same texture file in your project, the difference is what you put on top of the wall is going to be completely up to you. So this last part of this project is really just focusing on a layered material. So it's kind of taking the concepts from part 1 and part 2, like just building color and reflections, and then also stacking other textures on top of that. So it's a little hard to see, but in mine, there's kind of like a really faint dirt patch right there. You can almost see that kind of darker color above the handle. That's one texture I put on it, just a really subtle dirt stain. And then the other layer I'm doing are these giant chunks of red paint. And there's not really much of a trick to it. I'll actually kind of show you what that looks like. All I did is I went online in like a Google image search, and I found an image that looks like that. So this is actually my color file for the paint, but just the paint layer. And then I have an alpha that goes with it. But basically, once you have like a color texture, which could be wallpaper if you wanted to, and you also make like an alpha channel to kind of cut it out, kind of similar to masking that we've done in Photoshop. These two guys working together will allow us to kind of stack this extra material on top of the wall behind it. So kind of cool stuff. Students usually get kind of into the last part because you get a little bit of creative freedom to figure out how you guys want to approach the back wall. All right, so let's just kind of start off with maybe the first part. I think I'm just going to focus on the scraper because in the lecture videos, I actually already do the pulley. So I thought it'd be kind of fun if we did this guy today instead, just to change it up a little bit. All right, so this is kind of what my scene looks like at the moment. And so in case some of you guys are wondering about the lighting, you can actually see how my lights are set up. A little bit of a hint. I'm sure some of you are probably realizing how yours may be a little off at this point, but that's kind of the way my lights are set up. I got the key, there's my little shadow filter, that's the little IES light, there's my dome light in the background. But at the moment, all the objects are probably going to render completely gray. Yeah, just like this. So there's really no information on those materials quite yet. But let's just start with maybe getting the books assigned, kind of get that out of the way, and then we will get the scraper set up. So in the documentation, it's going to tell you the books are already in your scene. So let me hop in here. Now, my scene has all the materials in it because I'm kind of using a file I've already built, like the entire project. But when you get in your project, you should see there's 2 materials in there called Book 1 and Book 2. Just assign it to the appropriate object. So this right here is Book 1. So that gets this guy. This one right here on the top is going to get Book 2. And depending on what you guys are doing in the viewport, you might notice that like the material shows up black or it doesn't quite look correct. If you turn on the texture button, you may see the texture. But if you don't have the texture button on, it'll probably look like this. And honestly, even if you guys see complete black like that, don't panic. This is just because Maya's viewport doesn't know how to draw a RenderMan node. Because remember, Maya and RenderMan are really 2 different things. So RenderMan materials and textures and lights don't really show up in Maya's viewer. They typically only show up when you actually hit the render button. So I wouldn't really let that deter you guys from kind of moving forward. Honestly, as long as it looks good in the render view or the image tool, you guys are kind of good to go. So I've got the books assigned. Let me just try rendering it with an IPR, and we'll just make sure that we get some information. Now mine's going to be a little slower than what you guys typically deal with because I'm like running a GoToMeeting and I'm recording at the same time. So this is pretty chuggy compared to what typically happens. I promise it is really not this bad. This is just because my computer is about to burst into flames trying to run all these different applications at the same time. Okay, that's good enough. We're not going to let this thing go. But I mean, you can already tell, yes, it looks like the materials are working. And if I loaded in the reference image, this would probably be very close to that. But we'll hit escape. We're good. Now, one kind of small thing about the books is you can see that this is basically the full finished material. And one thing is when you look at the docs for this, like I'll go to part 1 for diffuse. I'm going to kind of skip past a few things here, but under part 1, right when you get to that second step, talking about the book materials, we do have them on the objects, but you'll notice that there is a reflection that's still visible. See how it's like kind of shiny? Let me kind of stop here for a second. We got a question. Load book to material. So you mean you can't assign it to the object? Okay, so let me show you what I think may have happened. All right, so what we're going to do is in any of these tabs, I don't know if you guys have multiple tabs in here yet. You actually clear this out. If you haven't done anything with these like separate tabs in the node graph in the Hypershade, let me just kind of clear this out and I'll kind of back up to what you're seeing. So the Hypershade starts out as just like a single tab, and the problem you're kind of running into with like assigning the book material is probably related to one of these two shaders missing something called a shading group. It's actually kind of good you brought this up because a couple people might run into this. It's a very weird issue. But what I'm going to do is click on book 1 and book 2, or really whatever shader is not applying. And I'm going to hit the middle button right here in the Hypershade with the two little arrows, kind of one going in and one going out. So it's called input and output connections. If I hit that, what it's going to do is graph the full materials for those two shaders. And again, this is kind of your reference. If you guys get stuck, you can sort of see generally what you're going to be doing this week. Now, when you graph that thing out, what you're looking for is to the right. There's supposed to be two shading groups, like two little blue nodes. Is there any chance, Megan, that one of your materials does not have this little blue node appearing next to it? Okay, is like one showing up and one isn't? Okay, so here's what we want to do. I'm going to try to recreate your problem. Hopefully I can do this. I don't know if it's book 1 or 2, but let me just break one of them. I'm going to pretend this doesn't exist. There we go. It's turning green. Good. I'm actually doing the same book. I'm actually going to put the original shader back on there. I'm trying to like actually force my scene to do what you're seeing on yours. Okay, so I have the original, that kind of gray looking shader on it. Hoping mine does not let me assign it. Please don't work. Crud, it worked. All right, I'm going to pretend it didn't work. Let's back up again. So mine's assigning. It's actually making that blue little node, but basically that guy right there, your scene is having an issue creating it, and that's the node that kind of connects the material to the geometry. So what I want you to do is go to the other shader, which is probably below it somewhere. You see that second or the other blue node called Pixar Surface 2 Shading Group? Yep, so we're going to click on it, and you're going to do, when you select it, do Command D, and you'll probably see it makes a copy of that in the node graph. And I want you to move that by the shader that is not creating the shading group, like next to the other guy. So you're kind of putting it next to it, almost like it looks kind of like the other one's set up. Okay. So what we're going to do is basically we're going to be recreating that connection right there. And this is really simple. See how there's a little green line going into something called surface shader? And if you click on the shading group, you can see there's an attribute called surface material. And there's an input where you can tell it's pulling from that book 1 material. We're basically doing the same thing for this guy. So what I want you to do is click on that blue node to load the shading group properties. Okay, nothing's connected yet. You're going to middle mouse drag your book 2 material onto the word surface material, like over here in the attributes. So you middle mouse drag from there onto that, not in the text box, like on the word right there. And you should see it does like a very similar connection as soon as you do that. Yep, and then try assigning it to the geometry and see if that worked. Awesome, good. So I'm actually kind of glad that happened. Not because I, want you to struggle, but it's actually kind of good that someone had that problem pop up, because that's going to be super handy for like 1 or 2 random people out there that just somehow run into that same glitch. But now you know. All right. So books look good. I'm back to what I was talking about. Oh, I need to assign that again. Here we go. So what I'm kind of going over in the documentation, though, is because we're not really getting to the point where we're doing reflections yet. And these books aren't shiny. But you'll notice, like in the render, they obviously are reflective. So you're kind of seeing like the final product, but we're not quite there yet. So what I want you to do for part 1 is we want to kill the reflection just temporarily, and then we'll turn it back on once you guys get to the point where you're actually making things shiny. Now to do that, what the docs are going to tell you to do is you go to the material. So like here's book 1. And I know you don't know what much of this means yet, but you're going to go to the primary specular section. We have a refraction index slider. You click on the white color box, and it's going to show you the value of that color, which is 1.5. You're just going to change that number of 1.5 to 1. And then go to the other material, do the same thing. Select it, click on that refraction index white color box. It says 1.5, put the value to 1, hit enter. So I know that you probably don't know exactly why we're doing that. Like, what does refraction index mean? How is that magically changing the reflections? But if I go back here and do a render, what we should notice is by turning the refraction index to 1, that is supposed to completely kill all the specularity. So let's just kind of give this a minute to update. And when you guys work on this, probably what you can do is just leave the IPR running instead of restarting this over and over again. Okay, there we go. So you can tell that with the reflection, I put the refraction index to 1, reflectivity's gone. And that's really all we need for part 1. And then obviously, eventually when you get to part 2 and we're ready to do the reflections, you're going to do the opposite and just put that number back to 1.5 on both materials. So hopefully that makes sense. But it's just a little trick just to turn the reflection on and off. All right. So we're good there. Let's try working on that scraper, and we'll kind of build this guy. So I'll hit escape. Now, one really cool thing about the Hypershade is you guys can set up multiple node graphs to build your shaders. And I don't know if Tony or the shading and lighting guys really got too much into this, but one of the things that really makes the Hypershade a little aggravating for students is the fact that every time you want to look at a material, you guys were probably constantly like regraphing a network like over and over again. As you probably remember, every time you'd graph a shader out, it would kind of sort of graph out in some random order, and it would be you have to kind of reorganize it and sort of visually wrap your head around like, where did I leave off? Like, what was this node again? Where is that connecting? But with this newer version of Maya, we can do multiple workspaces and multiple node graphs, meaning what you could do is have a different graph for each material if you wanted, and you don't have to constantly regraph it. So as an example, let's say that the default one called Untitled 1, maybe this is just like a sort of a sandbox where I'm really just playing around with things. I don't want this to be like a final work area for anything. So what I'm going to do is hit this button here called Clear Graph just to remove all the nodes because I don't really need anything there yet. I'm going to hit plus next to that to make a new tab. So notice how these are different graphs. And on this one, I'm going to double click where it says Untitled 2, and we're going to call this Scraper. So now what this means is when I make a material and if I graph it, if I'm in this tab, it'll appear in this workspace. And then if I go to another tab and I decide, I want this to be the pulley, I can basically click back and forth and I never have to really regraph a shader again. I just leave it open in both tabs and I can just kind of pick and choose which material I want to look at. So, excuse me, you guys may have a few of these guys before you're done with the project this month. Okay, so back with the scraper, I need to make the material. So to make the Pixar surface material, you can do this a couple ways. If you guys like the shelf buttons at the top, that little kind of star ball right there, if you right click, these are the two materials we're going to be using this month. There's the Pixar surface. Now if you click on that, it will make a material. So if I just right click, pick Pixar surface, you'll notice over here in the Hypershade, a new node has appeared at the top, Pixar Surface 8. And down in that workspace, because I happen to be in the scraper section, it just also is displaying the material down here. So that's totally fine if you want to do it that way. Let me delete both those guys. The other way to do it, if you guys prefer making materials right in the Hypershade, if you are in the creation window, and I know mine's not visible. I think some of you guys probably still have that creation thing on the left side somewhere. I don't like that visible. It takes up too much space. But if you right click in the node graph and you kind of get to the same window, under RenderMan Materials, you'll see there's the same thing right there, Pixar Surface. That's another way to make it. And another way also is if you use tab, if I hit tab and start typing PXR surface, you'll notice I can do a search, hit enter, and that makes the same thing. So there's a lot of different ways to make nodes in here. You guys can just kind of figure out which way you prefer. So this is going to be my scraper material, and I've already got this guy in here, so let me just kind of rename this. We'll call this GoToMeeting Scraper. So I'm just renaming that guy, and let's assign that to the scraper. Now, one thing that's a little different, I'm sure some of you guys are probably already kind of noticing here. Look what's happening when I select the scraper in the viewer. See how these are two different objects? And I know that's not how you guys probably have it set up. You probably have the scraper combined back together into one mesh. There's a reason I did this, and I'll get to this in a little bit. I broke mine up again so the handle's separate and the blade and all the metal pieces are kind of their own thing. That'll make sense in a little bit. But for now, what I'm going to do is assign that material to both objects. So assign, okay? Now the material is just still gray, so it's not really going to look any different because I haven't done anything to it. So the obvious thing is, all right, over here in the material, we have a color section. And I know you guys probably know what color is going to do. Like obviously it will change the color of the material. Okay, you can see that. Okay, that's our color. Now I'm going to hit the little connection button next to the color attribute, which means we're going to load in some type of file. So hit that little checker box. And then I want to pick just a regular, just 2D file. Okay, now if I look in the Hypershade, you'll notice as soon as I did that, the file node has appeared, and you can see the little connection where it's taking the color of the file and it's going into the diffuse color of the material. And again, diffuse color is that guy right there. So that's just kind of showing you visually the connection we made when we hit that button. Now on the file node, let's load in our image. So this is where we find our texture. Let's see, there we go. So there's my scraper texture. Load that in. And let's just kind of check out the render, right? You can see because I have the texture button turned on, it looks like it's showing up in the viewer. Looks pretty good. Let's try doing a render. There we go. All right. So the render appears to be working. You can see the texture is loading. That's just kind of a good just visual, verification that at least you're doing something right. Like the texture is appearing in the render, so we're good there. Now it doesn't mean that the texture is going to match the reference yet, because if I kind of look at that reference photo, and I know you guys are going to have it loaded in here. I'm just going to kind of look at this guy. You can even tell, like at this point, like that is way brighter than kind of what's going on over here. So we do need to fix some intensity. We haven't got bump working yet, so let's kind of take care of that. I'm actually going to leave this running for now, and this might be able to run in the background. Hopefully this works. Now, one kind of thing about this texture file is before we really get into like changing the intensity or anything like that, there's a few kind of small sort of technical steps we have to address on the file node. Now, I really don't want to get into like a huge discussion about this right now in the meeting, just for sake of time. But if you guys watch my diffuse lecture, you're going to see a point in the lecture with the campus students where I start talking about CRT monitors. You guys actually watched that video yet? I don't know if any of you have seen that part. I kind of start talking about this stuff, these guys. You'll see it when you get to the video, but if you watch that campus lecture video, I'm going to kind of go off on a little tangent talking about CRT monitors. And I know you guys aren't using a CRT monitor, but there's a little bit of like a history problem where because of these CRT monitors, they kind of cause this chain reaction of issues for us and kind of the way your computer interprets color. But essentially the cliff notes of this, like the extremely short cliff notes, are due to some problems with that monitor many years ago, all the colors you think you're looking at on your screen are not actually what the colors are behind the scenes. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but like the gray color here you're seeing is not, it may look like that color gray, but sort of the code or the numbers of the actual color like in the program are sort of saying it's a slightly darker version of that. So it's something related to called color space, color management, or linear workflow. But basically what we're kind of battling here is, and something you guys will kind of be practicing as you get deeper and deeper into these portfolio classes, is anytime you're bringing in a texture file into Maya, you have to tell Maya and RenderMan, or whatever render you guys use, you have to tell it, is this in the right color space? Does it look correct in the render? Should it be color corrected? If it's not in the right color space, which you usually will know pretty quickly because your texture is going to look really washed out, but if it isn't in the right color space, how do I fix it so it looks correct in the render? So I'll kind of show you guys generally the steps you're going to go through, and then if you do feel like you're not quite understanding the concept, and this took me months to really fully wrap my head around, if you want to learn more about this, what I'd suggest you do is at some point when you're bored, just go into Google, type in linear workflow. And this is a pretty hot topic currently in the industry because a lot of studios already have like a pipeline that does this for them automatically. But if you do linear workflow, and even check out that first link under Grayscale Gorilla, he has a pretty good little blog post about it. And he has a video too that goes with it. But he basically talks about what this is, why is it important, like why are we talking about this, why is it so confusing. But this is a really important concept that pretty much everyone that does lighting, compositing, or just wants to make anything look believable needs to really pay attention to. And at the end of the day, visually what this means is your render, if you don't do something properly, may look like this, where it's not to say it's going to be bad, but you'll start noticing that you're getting these like decay issues where your lights don't feel like they're doing something that's realistic, where it's not traveling as far. Your colors may look the wrong saturation. Things may look too dark. So it's just a nice way to kind of make sure that all your math and things are working behind the scenes properly. It's a bit complicated to get into right now, but there's a ton of information out there that kind of breaks it down into a lot more detail. Yeah, if your stuff is rendering too dark, like if you haven't really changed anything on the texture, and if you're just like literally loading in the texture file on the material and it's a dark almost immediately, that probably means that there could be something wrong with the lighting. So what you may want to do is just verify that, like, even back in the first week, are the lights even still working? So if you're not setting your project, is there a chance maybe the key light's hidden? Has the intensity been changed? Is the warm light broken? Is the dome light not reading its file? So maybe that's causing that to break. It's hard to say for sure what happened there, but you kind of want to go back a little bit and just verify before you even make a material, do your lights even look correct? Because if they're not working, that will definitely make something look pretty dark. But my issue right now is mine's actually looking way too bright. But let's kind of do this linear workflow thing real quick. So basically what you need to do is with the color file, there's something called color space. It's set to sRGB. This is correct. Now, if you watch the texture in the viewer here, okay, if there's only two options they're really going to be kind of picking between, you typically either want sRGB, which you can tell does look correct. Like that does look like my original texture. The other option that you'll sometimes use is this color space called raw. Now, when I pick raw, you'll notice how this does not look good, right? Like that is clearly washed out and not what we had in Photoshop. So while this one may look incorrect visually, technically the math kind of behind the scenes, like the numbers, this is better for the math and numbers. But for the color texture, I don't want to use raw because obviously that's going to make it look like that in the render view, which is not a good idea. So I'm going to go back to sRGB. Now, the other thing here is while this is affecting the scraper textures color space, look at the image tool with RenderMan, because this thing's still been rendering the whole time I've been talking. And notice how that texture file is not doing what this guy's doing. That's because this color space is telling Maya how to interpret that texture file, which is good for us if we're looking at it in the viewer. It's not really changing the way RenderMan does it. So that means the other thing we want to do is we have to add these extra controls in the file node to help RenderMan out. So RenderMan needs its own settings like this down here. So to do that, at the top of the file node, you're going to go to the attributes menu, go down to RenderMan, and you're going to pick Add Texture Controls. And it might take a second, but usually once you add that, if you look near the bottom of the file, you'll notice that a new set of controls has just appeared. And there's a lot of stuff we don't need to worry about, like filter settings or any of that. But the big one is this checkbox right here. Now, as soon as I added these settings, look at the render. You can tell this looks really washed out, like something is broken. It's because this is now finally doing something. Now RenderMan has the ability to like change the color space. And for the color file, we want to turn this on and just kind of give that a moment, and it should start updating again. It should go back to the way we had it. There we go. This is super fast. So it basically is putting it back to the way it should have. And I know this looked fine before, but just to kind of get used to the kind of the process, you kind of need some repetition. I still want you guys to add the RenderMan texture controls and turn that on just so you kind of get used to doing that, because there are going to be some file nodes where we want to turn this off. So for the color file, remember that you want sRGB color space, add your RenderMan texture controls, and then you turn that checkbox at Linearize sRGB on. And you should notice your texture looks exactly like it did from Photoshop. Now, from here, once we have that set up, now we can finally fix the intensity. So this is going to be really easy. On the material, if I go back here, you'll notice that the diffuse area really doesn't have many controls to it. It's pretty much, you've got something called gain, color, which is our texture, and another one called roughness. Now, roughness isn't going to matter for this part. We will be using specular roughness in a little bit. The gain is going to be really important, though. So you want to think of gain like your intensity for the texture. So it's set to 1, which means it's not really making things brighter or darker. But what I could do, since I clearly know that this should be a lot darker than what we're currently getting, is I'm going to go to the gain and cut this down. Let's do a gain of 0.5. And actually, kind of speed this up. You'll kind of see how my render is doing the entire image, which is really bad for me, especially because of how slow it is right now. Let's use the crop tool to make this faster. So if I go up here to the top, there's that crop tool in the image tool. We just click on it, marquee drag over this, and as soon as I hit R on my keyboard, that will tell the IPR to kind of update, and it's going to do it within the cropped region. So this might speed it up a little bit for us. So now let's try darkening that even a little bit more. Like we'll do 0.25. Not sure why that just hopped to the placement node. That was weird. There we go. Yeah, and you can tell again, it's just getting darker and darker. So eventually what you're trying to do is just get yours to feel like it's pretty similar to that. And I'm down to 0.25, and that's still not as dark. So I'd go even lower. But I'm not going to kind of keep messing with that. I'll let you guys figure that out. I'll maybe just go down to like 0.2, and we'll just we'll say we're good. But just get yours to match as close as you can. And this is going to be the exact same thing with the pulley. Same process. All right. So we're good there. Now, the other thing we want to do is now that we have kind of the color connected, the intensity feels about right, we're ready to get bump. So to find the bump attribute, you'll notice this appears in a few different areas, especially if you start like digging around in here. Under the advanced diffuse, you'll see there's a bump. But if you keep looking and you're just kind of exploring the material, look what's under advanced specular. Bump. In fact, almost every one of those sections has an advanced area, and it shows its own bump attributes. There's bump again. So even though there's bump listed in about 20 different areas, it doesn't mean you're going to connect in bump into like each one of those. The reason there's a bump under diffuse separately from the other ones is because sometimes when you're doing a material, you may want bump to only affect the diffuse properties, meaning like make the texture color look bumpy. But if I do a connection to bump here and I never connect bump into spec, it means even though the texture might look bumpy, the specularity and reflections are not bumpy. So what we want to do with the scraper is obviously like if this thing was bumpy, the reflection should also be bumpy. It's all the same thing, right? It's the same texture. So I want to find another bump attribute that's going to affect the entire material. And if you scroll way down past all these other controls, and there's a ton of good information on this in the help docs, by the way. They break down like everything in here. But if you kind of keep scrolling down far enough, you're going to end up in an area called globals. You go in there, the global bump is going to control the entire material. So as soon as you connect bump into here, this will make everything bumpy. That's definitely what we want. Now, but to make a bump texture, we need to make a black and white bump map. And before, you guys were doing this in Photoshop. But I don't want you using Photoshop to make every single black and white map. It's just not a really efficient way to do it. We are going to make the black and white maps inside of Maya. Now, to do this, I need to figure out what nodes can we use to turn this file to some other black and white image, almost like color correcting it like you would in Photoshop, like taking the saturation out of it or doing levels on it. Now, to do this the right way, according to that linear workflow I was talking about, anytime you do a black and white map like bump, roughness, transparency, specularity, opacity, like there's a ton of different textures you can make. All those black and white textures are supposed to use a different color space. So this means we need to have another file node so I can change this setting, because I don't want to change it on this guy or it's going to screw up the way the texture looks in the render. So what I want you guys to do is we're going to make a duplicate of this file. Now watch my nodes when I do this. I want to see if Maya does this again. Okay, notice how things are nice and organized. I'm going to click on the file, go up to Edit, down to Duplicate, and I'm going to pick Duplicate with Connections to Network. Okay, so watch my nodes. Oh, hopefully Maya does this. Okay, see what happened? Don't mind the error. That doesn't mean anything. But you'll see how Maya just like moved all my nodes around. That's kind of annoying, right? That will happen to you. And this is actually like a bug. I think they fixed it in 2018. For some reason, every time you duplicate something, Maya thinks it needs to like reorganize your graph. And that is extremely frustrating because you guys are probably moving things in like specific spots to keep it organized. So if you ever want to prevent Maya from like moving things around on you, all you have to do is in your graph, select all your nodes and hit the P key on your keyboard, like P as in pin. If you hit P, see how it drops like a little pin on any node I had selected? So anytime you have a pinned node, that just tells the Hypershade, don't move it around. Like you can still move it, but Maya won't do it for you. It's just a nice way to prevent your stuff from jumping around erratically. So here's my second file node I duplicated. Okay, and on this guy, we're going to go to here. You can see it's still loading the texture. But since this is going to be one of our black and white maps, I'm going to turn it to a bump texture. I need to change the color space to raw. Oops. Okay, raw. I know it looks washed out, but this is technically correct. And then down here under the RenderMan controls, we wanted linearize turned on the other guy. This file is where we want it turned off. So it's still on here, but it's off on this one. Now from here, we can now turn this to the black and white bump texture. So the trick I'm going to show you with this is called color remapping, and this is one of the most powerful techniques you can learn in the Hypershade. I use this all the time. So color remapping is basically just the idea of taking a color texture like this, or anything color, and then turning it to a black and white map, and then adjusting the contrast. So to do this, all I need is one node right next to it. We want to make a ramp. And you can use tab, type in ramp, but make a ramp, just your 2D ramp. Should look like this. Okay, the ramp comes with a 2D placement node. Let's delete that. I really only want this guy. Oh, one thing too about these errors I keep getting, they're not really doing anything. You know how you guys have that little shader ball thing somewhere in the top right? You notice that does not work with RenderMan, or it breaks like almost immediately. The shader ball in 2017, like something happened to it, and it just throws errors constantly. It was doing it with Metal Ray as well. So these errors I'm getting are related to the shader ball trying to draw something, even though I don't even have it visible. It's probably broken. But that's kind of why I keep getting these things. It's not actually affecting the render, so you can ignore that. But with the ramp, we need to connect the out alpha. So I need to pull the alpha channel from this image, and I'm going to connect it into the V coordinate. So if you hit the little plus next to UV coord, pull the out alpha, just kind of drag it down to V coord, it'll connect. And when I do that, look what happened to the ramp. Let me disconnect it. See how like the ramp just looks like a gradient? It's like black to white. As soon as I connect that to V coordinate, notice how the texture now shows up on the ramp, and it looks black to white. Now the cool thing about this is when you do this little connection right here, I know this probably seems very basic, like great, we turned it black and white. Like I could have done that in Photoshop. But because we're doing this in Maya, if you start moving those colors around on the ramp, watch what happens to the texture file. Doesn't this kind of seem similar to like levels or curves in Photoshop? I can flip them. I can invert things. Even if I want to leave it like over here, I could take the black color and make it lighter to compress the darks. I could take the white, make it darker. And if you really wanted to, for some reason, you could even make this a new color. I could decide At this point in the ramp, I want to use the color green, and it will throw green in like kind of the darker values of the texture. And I can move this over, and I could say at this point, it randomly turns to magenta. This is a terrible looking texture, but it's sort of like adjusting the different values and remapping it into a new set of colors and values on the ramp. But let me just reset this back to black and white. We obviously don't want color for a bump texture. Bump is supposed to be black and white. Now the way bump works is, remember how white kind of visually goes up and then black kind of pushes downward? So really the only thing you're concerned about with bump is you don't need to move any of the points around. Just look at your little preview. And if you're not seeing this, double click on that little icon and it should refresh it. But look at the preview. Does it look like the areas that should be lifting up are lighter than the areas that should be pushing down? So with the scraper, like if you think about the handle, for example, zoom in on that. So with the handle, we have a plastic background, right? And we have this kind of dirt and text on top of it. I know this should be the stuff that's on top of the plastic, so that should be going up. So this should be the lighter color. That should be the darker color. That's what bump it needs. Is the texture doing that? Yes, because I can even see here, those little dirt stains are lighter than the plastic next to it. So in this case, I actually don't need to do anything to the bump texture. Like it's already perfect. Now, in the event that some of you guys start doing a project in the future where you do a bump and it looks like it's doing the exact opposite, like you might do one where the handle's white and this is like dark oil stains on it or mud, and bump is going to think that darker color has to push in, so it's going to look like a dent. Even if it's backwards, it's easy. All you got to do is flip your colors, and as soon as you flip them, you've inverted the effect of bump. And so now you get the opposite. So what used to push in is now pulling upward. But for us, let's just leave it at default. And I'm going to immediately rename this thing. We're going to call this scraper bump. Now to connect it, we just can't connect this to the bump attribute. So let me find it. Here it is. Don't middle mouse drag it to bump yet. One thing we need to do is you have to make the bump 2D node ahead of time. Because before, when you guys were connecting into bump, Maya would automatically make the little bump 2D node for you and just like drop it in the middle of the connection line. RenderMan won't do that. We have to make the bump 2D. So before you connect it, just somewhere next to this guy, hit tab, type in bump, and you want to make bump 2D. And here we go. This is an easy connection because you can see if I start like wondering, which one of these do I have to connect into that little input, you'll see this clearly doesn't work. So let's just do the other option, out alpha. Now it connects. So that's in here. Now this is what I can connect to the bump attribute. So if I click on the shader, there's bump down in that globals area. I can just middle mouse drag this purple node, the bump 2D, right on top of the word bump. And you'll notice that makes the connection. Now you can also see in the Hypershade what that did, because as soon as I middle mouse drag on bump, see how it's just connecting that right here? So it is like the exact same thing would be if you guys just simply drag the little connection here and did that. It's doing the same connection. So it's, again, personal preference on kind of what you guys prefer. Now let me look at the render, because I'm pretty sure this is still going. Oh yeah, the image tool is still rocking, it's been rendering the whole time. And you really can't see much bump on it at the moment. It looks totally flat still. And that's because we missed one small thing. This is so easy to miss here. But you know how way back at the beginning, when I did that little out alpha to V coordinate, and I was saying how it's pulling the alpha channel from the file node? Well, you have to remember that our texture file doesn't have an alpha channel. Because like when you guys were doing your textures, you're just saving out a color image, right? It's just red, green, blue. You didn't make an alpha. Like that's not part of your texture. And so RenderMan can't find an alpha channel, and so it's not knowing what to do. So the fix for this is when you click on the file node, go to the color balance, like right below where we did that raw color space, go to color balance, and there's a little checkbox right here called alpha is luminance. Do you guys remember ever turning this on when you were with Tony, and like in shading and lighting? Did he like cover that thing at all? Because I feel like this may have come up at some point when you were doing like connections. You can see like that is already getting really bumpy. It's kind of grainy looking. Yeah, it probably popped up at some point. I don't really know what project you guys were maybe doing that with, but as soon as you turn that on, it basically tells RenderMan that the alpha isn't really an alpha channel. It's actually pulling the alpha from the color of your texture. So even if you don't really quite understand that, I would say just to kind of play it safe, maybe for every file node, just kind of turn that on like autopilot, just to potentially avoid the headache of trying to figure out why something isn't working. Like there's a good chance 99% of the time you probably do want that turned on. So sometimes I'll just do it just out of habit, and even if I don't actually need it. All right, so we got bump. And actually you can see, like, even though I'm kind of taking my time explaining it, we've kind of already finished that entire material for the first part of the project. So you can tell it's not really that much work. It's just going to seem kind of weird because you guys have never done these connections before, but it's already kind of done. And I think the bump's a little intense, so maybe what I would do if I just thought the bump was a little too, too crazy. On the bump 2D node, the bump's at 1, just cut it in half, like you can do 0.5, and that will just sort of drop that intensity down a little bit. And if you put it to 0, you're basically turning off bump. So it's usually between 0 and 1, you guys will kind of figure out kind of a good balance or number to settle on. But for now, I think we'll just stick with 0.5 and kind of call it a day. Okay, so that's part 1. Before I kind of get into part 2, how do you guys kind of feel about that? You guys have like any questions about anything there? I know that the color space thing doesn't quite make a whole lot of sense yet. But as far as like the connections and just kind of what we were doing, does that seem pretty straightforward? All right, awesome. Let's keep on moving. I'm not going to do that again for the pulley. You actually can watch that in the lecture recording because I do this with the campus students. Let's do some spec. And it's actually kind of good I'm doing this because it's a really interesting problem that's going to come up with the scraper. All right, let's try this out. So with specularity, let's kind of go to the material. This is now part 2. And if I kind of look near the top, we already saw the spec area. It was actually right below where we were doing our color texture connection. And we have a primary specular area where we have like Fresnel modes, face color, edge color, exponent. I'll let you guys watch the lecture video where I really break down like what all those are doing like individually. I'm not going to get into that right now for the sake of time. But what the documentation is going to tell you is that before you get too far with the spec, you basically just want to like set up a few like default settings just to at least get specular properties enabled. So like before we make a texture, let's just turn spec on and try to get something kind of like middle of the road. Okay, let's go down here. Oh, actually, let's do the book thing real quick too. So I want to get the books reflecting again. So let me show you how to do that. So I'm ready to see reflections on the book. All we had to do was change that refraction index on the book back to 1.5. And I'll do that for both. And obviously you wouldn't do this until you're at that point. So both of those go to 1.5. I don't know if we can see it in the render, but they're going to start looking kind of shiny again. Yeah, there's a little bit of a reflection showing up on part of the weather. There we go. Okay, back to this guy. Okay, in the docs, look at step 3. So what you want to do is change the Fresnel mode from artistic to physical, and these kind of numbers I'm giving you are just like really good starting values, just so you can at least see something in the render before you start tweaking things. So edge color is going to be 0.5, refraction index is 1.5, extinction coefficient is 0, roughness is 0.5. So let me do that real quick. What that means is over here under primary spec, change that Fresnel mode to physical. put the edge color, you click on it, put that to 0.5. Refraction index is already set exactly where you want, 1.5. Extinction coefficient is already at 0, so those two guys were good. The only other thing we need to change is roughness, and we're just going to put that to 0.5. So it's really, the main one you're changing is just the drop down and then putting those two guys, edge color and roughness, like right in the middle. So look at the render and look what happened. So you can see how like immediately, even though it doesn't really look good, you can tell like it is reflective. It almost looks kind of wet, like it maybe has like a lacquer or some type of clear coat on it. So it is working, which is all I'm really looking for right now, is like spec is running. Now the goal with this thing is to hopefully get like all these areas to look pretty close to the reference. So one thing you'll kind of notice up here, like with the scraper, is that the handle is relatively kind of shiny, especially near the bottom and that right side right there. So how do I do that? How do I break up the spec and kind of get it to feel right? And with the pulley, earlier I was mentioning how like the blue paint is kind of reflective, but the rust is very dry. So really our main problem is understanding how do I make a texture, kind of like the bump texture, but how do I make another one of these textures very similar to this that will tell the specularity how shiny those different areas are supposed to be. Now for the scraper, I need to make a new black and white map. So what I need is really this texture file. Instead of going to bump, well, we're still going to leave that. I'm also going to have this file branch off into another ramp below it, and the ramp over here is going to be something completely separate we're tweaking for spec. Now I could make a whole new ramp and do the exact same connection. So if you wanted to, you could do tab, ramp, make a ramp texture, or pick it in the little creation area and do it that way. So, I mean, you could totally do this, make a new ramp, and just do the connection the exact same way again. But you know how I'm basically just recreating the same thing I just did? So you don't have to always do something from scratch. So if you want to do it a little bit faster, if you just click on that same ramp and go up to Edit, if I do Duplicate with Connections, and let me actually pin my nodes real quick before I do that so it doesn't move around. But if I duplicate that with Connections, just like with the File node, it's going to make a copy, but because I'm doing that special way, it already has the connection built for me. So that just saves me a few extra seconds of connecting things together. And let's immediately rename this. This is not bump. This is scraper. We'll do roughness first. And roughness, actually, let me show you this. You can see roughness, because you probably don't know what this means yet. Actually, do you guys remember I know we were talking about the Mia material earlier. Do you guys remember what that glossiness attribute was doing with the Mia? It was like in that reflection area. Because this roughness is like almost exactly the same thing as glossiness. That was that slider you were kind of moving back and forth, and it was making like the highlight get sharp or really blurry. This is that on the RenderMan material. It's just a different name. So just kind of watch the render when I move roughness around a little bit. So here's the render. Let's take that roughness and let's just slam it down to 0. This should update. So here's no roughness. Now I know it looks really grainy, but look what's happening to the handle. Let me actually make this smaller. I'm going to try to get this cropped to only render this top part here. This is taking a little bit too long. Scale that in and hit R just to update that. That's a little better. So I'm just kind of letting the handle update so you can see this. So notice how when I brought the roughness down, like before it kind of had like a sort of a dry-ish looking highlight. Isn't that kind of looking a lot more wet now? Especially down here. So we've made the highlight way sharper. So this is almost like a mirror right now. But the bump's still making it look kind of bumpy. So I guess it's like a bumpy clear coat. Now on the flip side, if I have a high roughness, watch what happens. See how that looks way drier, almost like dirt? So that's basically what you're kind of thinking about, is with the roughness texture, how do I get the handle to look kind of shiny, but that stain and dirt on it to look like what's happening right now. So I want this drier highlight on that part. I want that wet highlight on the plastic. That's really why we need the texture, to help control those areas separately. So let's put that back to 0.5. Hopefully that makes sense the way I'm explaining it. But so over on here, I know I haven't really changed anything with the black and white texture. It just kind of looks like the bump still. But let's just kind of connect it and just see, like, what is it even doing? So let's go to the material. We'll select it. There's our roughness. I'm just going to middle mouse drag that to roughness. So it's connected. That's now controlling the roughness. This render should update. Actually doesn't look too bad. Was not expecting that. That looks unusually kind of like similar to the reference without any work. I swear it's not normally this easy. But we kind of got lucky where it's very close just by like a happy accident. But let me show you kind of what this looks like. So when you guys end up tweaking this thing, most materials are not going to be that close just like by luck. They're probably going to look a little wrong. So when you're trying to tweak specularity, it might be easier for you guys to turn off the color just temporarily so you can look at the spec by itself. So earlier I was kind of using that diffuse gain to darken the texture. What I usually do is I write down that number just so I know what to put it back to. So I'll write down 0.2 somewhere in my notes. And just for a few minutes here, let's take that diffuse gain to 0. Because when you put it to 0, you basically just killed the diffuse color. But I know that doesn't look good, but by doing that, it's going to help you see what the specularity is doing. So we're really looking at just a render of the reflection right now. Let's kind of zoom in here a little bit. And what you can kind of see, it's a little hard. Right here is that dirt. And it kind of looks like, kind of seems like that's pretty dry. Actually, yep, that has a higher roughness on it. But if I want to tweak it, the trick with this thing, and the same thing I kind of show the campus students in the video, is when you click on the roughness, you have to figure out how to move these colors around to get the perfect texture. And this is a really, really kind of a slick little trick I found out. So that what we need to do is when you connect it to the material, there's a little S button on the node. I don't know if you guys have ever figured out what that little thing is doing, but check this out. This is such a cool part of the Hypershade. If you hit S, look at the viewer. Let me turn that off again. The S button will make Maya show you what this texture looks like on the model. Meaning if you hit S on another node, like if I do it on the bump, it'll probably show bump. Might take a second. There it is. It's showing me the bump information in the viewer. If I do it on the original file node, it'll show me the texture. If I do it on the 2D placement node, it'll probably show me a UV pass. Yeah, that probably looks weird to you, but that's the UV coordinates. It's just doing a weird green to red representation of the UVs. But when you hit S on the roughness texture, what we want to do is instead of having it black to white, just for a minute, let's change these to colors. So I'm going to take the black and I'm going to make this something really obnoxious. And I'm going to do what I typically do with the campus students. We're going to make this red. I'm going to take the white and make that color blue. Now I know this looks kind of weird, but what this is going to do is when you make it red and blue, you should notice in the viewport, it's kind of showing you generally where your texture is lining up. Now the goal for this is I want this color to control the plastic. I want this color to only control the dirt. It kind of does. It's kind of funny you mentioned that because like if you actually change this to like another weird setting like a rainbow, you can kind of get these weird like heat map looking effects, which is kind of like what the Predator does. So now if you guys ever decide to do like Splinter Cell or like the Predator remake, you know the secret. It's going to do this little color remapping trick, make the ramp turn to like red, green, blue colors, and you're basically halfway there. All right, let's kind of go back to the red and blue. But with this guy, see how like the handle isn't really red? The handle is like somewhere in that kind of reddish magenta, like right around there. Some of the dirt's almost blue though. What I'm going to do is move this over just a little bit, and right there, see how the handle's like solid red? So anything I do to this color is only going to affect that part of the handle. Now with the dirt, which is kind of not quite blue, it's a little purpley, we're going to move that over right there. See how I have some nice breakup? Now I may not want to cram them too close together, because if you start slamming these guys really close like this, that's going to make some like really sharp lines between like the highlight. It's going to look too like CG and kind of awkward. I do want to have some breakup, and I don't like how flat that is, so I usually kind of leave mine a little bit apart, just so I can still get a little bit of variation. Like something like this might be nice. So even the handle has some like breakup and noise in it. Now from here, what I need to do is figure out, all right, the points look like they're in the right spot. Like that red is definitely the handle. The blue is clearly the dirt on the handle, like in all the text. And from here, you just get to figure out how rough should those areas be. So remember back here in the material, when I was moving that roughness slider, I was just going from like 0 to 1. 0 is no roughness, which means it's very sharp like a mirror. 1 is a blurry, dry highlight. What do we think they should be for the plastic and the dirt? Now, I know we don't necessarily know the exact number, but what I do know is that that plastic should be sharper and more reflective than that dirt on it. So this is the less rough part. This is the rougher part. So the texture should kind of look like this. I'll kind of show you a guess. Where's my text? Let's do, so roughness. Okay, 0. Come on, you can do it. I'm going to laugh if text edit is the thing that killed my computer. Out of all the things to crash, text edit. Let me actually close out of this completely. Let's not do that. I'm on the verge of like crashing because text edit can't even load. Basically what I'm getting at is we just need to go to the ramp, and I'm going to take out the color. So pull out the saturation on the red, go to the blue. Okay, go to this guy, pull that saturation out of that one. And I'm going to make this one like a gray. And since this color right here, remember this red that I used to have was the handle, the plastic, I want that less rough. So I'm going to make that darker. So basically, we have now made a roughness texture. And even if we notice, like let's say we render it, and you feel like this is still, it's too sharp. Like I wish it was blurrier. If you make that color lighter, you are now blurring only the reflection of the plastic. Because see how that's only affecting the plastic part? This is separate. That's now controlling the dirt. It has no effect on the plastic area. This is way better than doing that in Photoshop. So maybe this seems like an okay result. Let me just see what's going on here. Yeah, you can kind of see it. It's not that different what I had earlier, because I kind of got lucky and the original texture was kind of close. But if I kind of move this around, like if I flipped them, like if I made this one darker and made this brighter, you should see the opposite effect where see how the handle is now the dry part? But like that dirt, it looks like it's kind of wet because I flipped the effect of roughness. But this is really, really powerful. We're doing that all inside of Maya. No more saving black and white maps out of Photoshop. Okay, so that's doing the roughness texture. And optionally, this is optional, the other thing you may want to make, which is not required, is sometimes you want to change the edge color. So you might not just want to make it blurrier. You may want to actually make like the reflection darker or make it brighter. So you could do a texture for edge color. It's basically just doing another black to white map. Very similar to this, where I probably just duplicate it. and then I would connect it to edge color. And if you wanted to, on that duplicated texture, you could kind of make the colors lighter and darker, and it would basically just make your highlight look like it's more intense or less intense. I mean, actually, let me just kind of show you what edge color looks like. Like if I make this brighter color, we'll probably see that looks brighter. Yeah, see how it's just becoming more intense? It's almost like the intensity, but for just the reflection. But if you have a texture in it, you can kind of make the different areas sort of have different values if you want to, add that extra level of control. So maybe what I'll do, just because I know that plastic was kind of shiny, I could kind of raise this up a little bit just to sort of exaggerate that highlight right there. So that is the specularity part. And let me turn the gain back since I did lose that. So I'm going to put that back to 0.2 just so we get the color back. And this is kind of where you'd sort of compare to the reference. Let me see how close I'm at. Not actually too far off. I know it's kind of grainy because the render's having a hard time keeping up here. But you can kind of see I'm not too far off. It might be a little too reflective on the plastic. It's kind of grayish looking, but I'm getting close. I do like how I'm getting that highlight on the bottom, just like that right there. And you're doing the same thing for the pulley. Now, the one small little issue with the scraper, and I'll show you this, is that, see how we got the handle like pretty close? What's going on with the blade? Let's move this down and find out. Because the blade is also changing. I just haven't been seeing it because I don't have the render over it. So let's move the little crop window to it, hit render. Now, it clearly has changed from what I had before because I started making new textures and connecting it. You'll notice for some reason at the bottom, see how it looks incredibly shiny down there. That's kind of weird. This is something a lot of students run into. This is not a bug. Sometimes what happens is when you're doing something like the plastic, you might be able to get this perfect, but unfortunately, getting the texture to look perfect on this might mean the blade or some of the metal pieces looks worse. Now, this is just an issue where you're kind of going to discover that one material and one texture may not work for every single piece at the same time. And that's exactly what we're running into. So I don't want to mess with the texture because I really like what we're getting here. So how do I get this blade to still look like the reference? This would be a really good time to just try doing a different material. So let me hit escape for a second. Okay. And this is how you duplicate materials. And I do this a lot. If you guys are kind of, you might use some of this class content for like reference later on. When you guys build one of these materials, what you could do is when you get the full thing completed this week, if you think it looks really good, if you select the shader and do File, Export Selected Network, you can actually save out that full shading group, like that full network, and then reuse that almost like a template in another project. So you can actually import this shading network into another scene, and then all you got to do is like connect in your texture files, slap it on the object, and you're basically like halfway there to being done with the material. So I kind of use these as like a starting point sometimes. So I'm not rebuilding it over and over again. But I want to make a new version of this for the blade. So how do I make a duplicate? So what I want to do is click on the material. Okay, let's back up. I'm going to go up to Edit, Duplicate, and then pick Duplicate Shading Network. Now it's going to get a little messy because Maya just loves to throw these nodes everywhere. But let me just kind of select both these materials. You actually can see the duplicate here. And I'm going to pick Graph In and Out Connections again. That middle button right there. Oh, that's wonderful, Maya. Thank you. Let me try clearing the graph and doing that again. It is clearly not going away. That's great. Let's see, this is the duplicate. Let me try doing Graph Network. Really, Maya? Okay, there's another button. This might work. Rearrange graph. Come on. Okay, that kind of works. Yeah, it's a little messy because I have to kind of rearrange it in the right order again, but this is still the same stuff. So if I kind of get it back to like what we had earlier, it would be kind of like that. There we go. That's basically this thing right up here. And then I could assign this to the blade. So that's actually why I have the metal separate, because I wanted to put a different material on it. So I'm just duplicating it, assigning the new material to it. Okay, so now that's on there, meaning if I were to now go in there, and I didn't really like how like just overly bright that was. So on this material, I could go to edge color and knock that back a lot. And let me actually try rendering this again. I think I stopped the IPR. But if I re-render it, we should notice that that blade is not as bright. It's because I brought down the edge color on that material. Yeah, all right, let's hit R. And yeah, it's already not nearly as crazy as it was earlier. And if I still thought this was a little too washed out, I could just like knock that down even a little more. You can kind of see that kind of glazed reflection is starting to fade away. And now I might be able to get the blade kind of close to the reference, but it has no impact on what the handle's doing. Because again, they're two completely different materials. You can tell like that's starting to look pretty good. And with that shiny handle, I think we're going to be pretty close. So it's the same thing for the shelf, exactly what I did there. The pulley is pretty much the same workflow. We didn't do the metal yet, but the metal is easy. That you're just going to grab a preset. So if you ever want to get a preset, go up to the little open preset browser. You'll see a little tab pop up on the right. And then under metal, maybe do one of the plain metals. I don't really care which one you pick. You guys can kind of pick whatever one you want. I don't remember the one I used, but let me just assign a new one. So I'm just going to grab these guys. Oops. And let's see, what do we want to do today? Let's do copper. So if I just right click on this little copper preset, import and assign to selected, which means it's going to put it in the Hypershade and assign it to those objects. Okay, copper's on there. We'll probably see it's in here somewhere. Oh, I used nickel last time. There's copper. So this is now a new preset. And if I move this over here and hit R, we should see it. Yeah, there it is. Now they're copper. So their metal presets look really nice. They're probably some of the best metals I've seen in any renderer. Like way better than like Metal Ray. All right. Let's see. So that was kind of, that's pretty much the main things I wanted to cover with you guys. We actually got through a lot more than I was expecting. Do you guys have any questions about any of that stuff? But we basically just did the workflow for part 1 and part 2. The only thing we didn't get to, I just don't think we're going to have time because it's a little bit more involved, is getting into the layered material. But there's a whole lecture that covers it. So if you just kind of watch through the lecture, you'll see me build the Pixar layered surface, and I'll talk about how you layer materials, how do you build an alpha to cut out where the materials stack on each other. So you can kind of just follow through with that. So you mean like on the file node, like how did I add those controls to it, like with the whole linear? Yep, I'll show you that. Okay, so what we did is, let's see here. So there's 2 file nodes. I'm not sure if you have both file nodes in here yet, but you might just have like the very first color one. So on the color files attributes, so just click on your file node, look at your attribute editor, and one small thing. I'm actually kind of glad you brought this up. In your Hypershade, do you have this thing sitting somewhere on the right side? Because this is usually part of the Hypershade, the property editor. Is that like in yours? Okay. So I don't think the property editor will show you it. So I kind of stopped relying on this guy because if you kind of compare this to the attribute editor, see how it doesn't have these controls at the top, and it's almost like a shortened version of all the different things in here. So I would almost recommend just closing out of that completely and kind of just using the attribute editor instead, because it might be hiding the controls you need. But in the attribute editor on the file, go up to the attributes menu, go down to RenderMan, and you're picking that one right there. And this is again on the file node, not the material. And as soon as you hit that, you should see at the bottom of the file node, this RenderMan section is going to appear. Yep, this is recorded. I'm actually amazed the recording is still working because my poor render is struggling. So what I'll do for you guys is we'll kind of call the meeting adjourned here today, and I'm going to stop the recording. I'll get this posted on YouTube. It might take a little bit to upload because it's like a 2-hour video almost. But as soon as that thing is like uploaded and converted, I will send all you guys the link to it on my YouTube channel. And then you can kind of just watch through this again at your leisure once you start working on the project. But it might not be till like tomorrow morning until I get a chance for it to actually finish. Yep, we can definitely schedule some time. I've got lecture tomorrow afternoon. I've got a little time in the morning, maybe like between 10 and noon. Outside of that, it might have to be either in the evening or I'll have to kind of figure out something on the weekend possibly. Does tomorrow morning work for you? Okay, let's plan on that. So what I'll do, Tony, is I'll just send you I'll send you like a separate GoToMeeting invite for like a meeting tomorrow morning. Yep, no problem. All right. Well, thanks guys for hanging out. Pretty good little meeting. I'll post this up on YouTube, and I'm sure I will catch up with you guys later this week. No problem. Glad to help out.